Hey everybody, how are you doing? Welcome to another edition of the Biotech Capital Compass podcast series. These are recordings that we do that accompany many thoughts of ours, and we have different series. This is a video companion for a newsletter that we wrote. That was part one, actually, of a three-part series. And we called it "Not All Competition is Zero Sum." Now, the sort of the context of this was why biotech investors may be thinking about competition too narrowly. That's really what was the subtext of what we're writing in that part one. We'll talk more specifically about certain stocks in part two and part three, and again with the idea of why not all competition is zero sum and what that means in the stock market, especially in biotech investing. So again, welcome to another edition of the Biotech Capital Compass. I just went for a very long walk here in Williamsburg. Went and picked up some tea at Whole Foods, sat down by the East River, which actually is not a river. You should look into that. It's really fascinating. I learned that once when I was taking a ferry ride and got off at the wrong stop by mistake, but which actually happens more than is typical for most people. For me at least, it happens a lot because I'm in my own world. And then I walk back. It's a beautiful day. The sun is coming in through the window. I'm a very, very lucky person to be able to focus on the things that I love, enjoy this beautiful weather, live in a thriving community, and just in a place where there's a great vibe. And also, again, thankful for my family and friends. So let's get going. This is a shorter video companion to our latest edition of The Skeptical Lens, where we introduced a framework that I think quietly sits underneath a huge amount of biotech investing, but is not examined carefully enough. Now, there's a reason why we're just focusing on part one of this framework. It's more theoretical. Part two and part three, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be focused on specific stocks. But let's walk through the theoretical part of this in this short video companion, just to help better explain, what it is that I'm trying to get at. Now, this framework is this idea of zero sum versus win-win markets. Now, at first glance, that sounds a little abstract, but I actually think it has very real implications for how investors think about risk, portfolio construction, and even how they emotionally react to competition in biotech. Because if you spend enough time around biotech investing, and I've spent roughly 2 decades doing this, you notice something interesting. The default mindset on Wall Street is usually who wins. A new drug approaches launch, a company gets exciting data, almost immediately the conversation shifts towards market share. Analysts build models, investors debate peak revenues, and the framing becomes very binary. This company wins, and therefore somebody else loses. And that's usually the narrative, especially if it's a first-to-market company. And to be clear, sometimes this framework is absolutely correct. It really works out. There are markets, especially certain oncology settings, where patient populations are relatively fixed, treatment algorithms are well defined, and newer therapies generally do take share from incumbents in a fairly direct manner. That is real. But what fascinated me over time is that there are other markets where something very different happens. The introduction of multiple therapies actually helps build the market. Diagnosis improves, awareness increases, physicians become more comfortable treating the disease, guidelines evolve, patients enter the system who previously were untreated or undiagnosed. And suddenly, the opportunity itself becomes larger than what investors initially modeled. That's actually very cool. Win-win. There is such a thing in biotech land. That is the win-win framework we discuss in the note. And candidly, I think investors often underappreciate it because the financial system itself tends to reward simpler narratives. Winner takes all is a cleaner story than multiple therapies may collectively expand a category over time. Like, oh, excuse me, oh my God. Multiple therapies may collectively expand a category over time. Some people might say, don't call me, I'll call you. Whereas when you say winner takes all, it's just a cleaner story. It sounds sexy, it sounds amazing, and it's easier to go with that. But biotech and biology generally is often messier, more adaptive than that. One of the reasons I wanted to write this piece is because I realized that over time, my own thinking had evolved a bit. Early in my career, particularly on the sell side, there was naturally a stronger focus on precision, target prices, relative positioning, who wins versus who loses. And all of that does matter. I mean, there are definitely markets and stocks you want to pick where there is a zero sum game and one company that is just exceptional at what they do and execute, phenomenally well is going to win. But over time, and especially now with the help of AI tools, broader data access, and frankly, just experience, I've become increasingly interested in systems and incentives. How do markets evolve? How do narratives form? What kind of assumptions become embedded too early? Where are the investors potentially thinking too narrowly? In many ways, the biggest influence on me stylistically was Ed Hyman at ISI, whose macro work I used to read a while ago when I used to work at Visium Asset Management, a hedge fund. I was a long short analyst slash PM, but owned a very, very tiny little book, investing mostly on European biotech and biopharma companies. But I used to get his research that was provided to all the Visium folks. And Ed Hyman Asa was just amazing. I mean, I used to read his stuff and I'd be like, man, one day if I write, I want to write like him. What always struck me was not that he tried to predict everything perfectly. It was that he created simple, reusable frameworks that help people interpret complexity. That stayed with me. And I think biotech increasingly needs that kind of thinking because of the volume of information today is overwhelming. Clinical data, regulatory changes, payer dynamics, social media interactions, AI generated analysis. It can become almost impossible to parse in real time. So part of what I'm trying to do with the skeptical lens is slow things down a bit and ask, what is the underlying structure here? Not just what happened today. That's really the spirit of this series. In part two, we'll apply this framework directly to PH-ILD, that's pulmonary hypertension with interstitial lung disease, and IPF, that's interstitial pulmonary fibrosis, and specifically to United Therapeutics, Liquidia, and Mankind. And the key question there is whether investors are potentially viewing these companies through too narrow a competitive lens. Then in part three, we zoom out further and ask, is biotech entering a more expansionary phase again? Who benefits beyond the drug developers themselves? That's where companies like Thermo Fisher come into the conversation. Anyways, I hope you found the frameworks useful, just this broad theoretical framework that we've built. Part one of the series is unfortunately a paid newsletter. Part two and part three will be also paid, but these video companions are free. And I hope, at least for those people who don't want to step up and be paid members of the Biotech Capital Compass yet, these video companions are useful. So again, as I said, I hope you found the framework as I described it useful and hopefully reusable, because ultimately the goal here is not simply to identify good companies, it's to develop better ways of thinking how biotech markets actually evolve over time. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in part two. Take care. Have a good day wherever you're at, and talk soon.